Hi everyone and welcome. Today we are joined by the economist, the professor, Richard Wolff. It's fantastic to have you back.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
I wanted to ask you first about the scope and the state of the trade war between the United States and China, because I guess the scope is quite wide. We're not just talking about trade, we're not just talking about tariffs, technologies, financial. It encompasses quite a wide range. How can you explain the trade war?
Well, I think I have to respond to the very good question by splitting my level of response. So I'm going to start by saying what I think Mr. Trump's regime's motivations are, what their hopes are to get out of this. This is very much an American policy. No one should be under any illusion. The Europeans don't want this, did not push for it. The Chinese don't want this, did not push for it. This is an American initiative and should be understood in that light. So, first, let me say what I think the regime's goals are in doing all of this. And then let me talk about what I believe are the more important and underlying causes for the whole spectacle, the whole theater. It is fashionable here in the United States for the Democratic Party, the party that lost the presidential election, and the party that lost control of both houses of the U.S. Parliament, the Congress of the United States, giving Mr. Trump pretty much an enormous amount of power that he does not have to bargain with a powerful opposition. It's not that he has total power, he doesn't, but he has more than most presidents usually do. And he has decided to make use of that by being more ambitious, more willing to go to extremes than have either Republican or Democratic presidents for quite some time. You might even say for most of the last 75 years. And those 75 years, basically the period since the end of the Second World War, have been a time not only of moderate behavior by American presidents and Congresses and by the two parties, but it's also, and not coincidentally, been a time of the American empire, the heyday, the peak, if you like, of a process that began already at the end of the 19th century, in which the United States displaced the British Empire from that global role. And that made it possible for the United States to make the dollar the world currency, to become the dominant economic, political, ideological, and military power. The problem is that the very success of that position, and this has happened many times in history, proved also to be its undoing. So, for example, having the dollar the world currency gave the United States an enormous subsidy because the central banks around the world, in Norway, in Europe, in Asia, added to their reserves behind their own currencies, not just gold, but the US dollar, which was, quote unquote, as good as gold. And that meant that the United States could bring in French wine, Norwegian sardines, and oil, and all the rest of it, and in exchange, give you basically worthless pieces of green paper. And since you didn't want to hold worthless pieces of green paper. You use them to lend money to the United States government, which in turn used that money to pay for the empire. So, in a way, if you understand the economics, the United States in that manner got the rest of the world to finance the empire that dominated the rest of the world. It did it in a way somewhat different from how the British did it, but pretty much the same thing. When the British, ripped off India, used Indians in their army, used Indians in every conceivable way, you have a very similar situation, a bit more concentrated in the areas of the British Empire. The US dollar could do it everywhere, didn't have to have it literally part of the empire, but conducted the same, how shall I put it, fundamentally exploitative arrangement. Well, this made it so easy to borrow that our political economy became an economy in which the Republicans, who limited taxes on corporations and the rich to build up their support in the society, and the Democrats, who tended more to spend money on the mass of people to build up their support in the population, put the political leaders in an impossible situation. You could not tax, the Republicans couldn't tax the rich because that was their donor base. Politics in America is very much a matter of money. So the Republicans get their money from the people whom they protect against taxes. So you shift the burden of taxes onto the mass of the working class until they have no more money and are angry. And then the Democratic Party doesn't dare tax the mass of people either. So, how are you going to spend money on what people need? A global empire, a defense establishment bigger than anything in the world, and roads and highways and schools and hospitals? The answer is you borrow. And you borrow because you can, because the whole world is busy parking the dollars that they need in the form of treasury securities. So we go into debt. Our debt is now $35 trillion, and our GDP is about 26 or $27 trillion. You see the problem. And a week ago, Monday, the Japanese, one of the most docile allies the United States has had since the Second World War, for the first time said, it is too risky. You cannot ask us to lend you more money. I should mention, the United States is the biggest debtor country in the world. And the number one creditor of the United States is Japan. And the number two is the People's Republic of China. And therein lies more than I can explain in many hours. Just remember what I just said. You will understand where we are. So, what is Mr. Trump doing? He's desperately trying to deal with the impossible situation of the American government's finances in the conditions we now face. It's trying to bring down the spending more aggressively than anyone has done, and he's trying to bring up the income of the government more aggressively. When it comes to cutting spending, that is, as I'm sure you and your audience know, the wholesale canceling of half of what the federal government does. This has nothing to do with efficiency, which it isn't. It is an exercise in whatever the opposite of efficiency is. That's what we're watching. And everybody with half a brain knows it. This is not about efficiency. This is about taking care of business by slashing whatever the government does, because whatever damage that does is less than the existential risk of being unable to borrow, which is the way this empire has been held together. And number two, to try to make an income for the government out of imposing tariffs on the whole world, trying to tell the American people that this is a burden on everybody else, not them, as if the whole world, faced with tariffs, will now bring their prices down to offset the impact of the American tariff and thereby hold on to their market in the United States. Because if the tariff adds to the cost for Americans, if you in Norway reduce the price of your oil or your sardines or anything else, then the price won't go up so much and you'll be able to hold on to your market. But the government will get the revenue of the tariff to bring that in. And by doing it to everybody, the whole world, you can begin to see the empire trying to hold on, but you must understand it is desperation that drives this, not some cool working out of a new policy. This is the old policy, cutting spending, which Republicans do. If there's anything new, it's that the Republican Party, having spent the last century being the anti tax conservatives, have now imposed the biggest tax imaginable on the American people. This will come back to haunt them because it's an opposition to every ideological, these are libertarians. They believe that the government should be minimally involved. They are bringing the government in massively. We have turned away from globalization and neoliberalism to self focused economic nationalism. And there is no concern for the rest of the world, and particularly not for the allies, Canada and Mexico here, and the Europeans and the Australians and so on around the world. This is a plan. It's not very well thought through. It is already producing backlash that makes it very unclear whether this is going to work at all. But it is a plan. Okay, so that's the first level. The second level is this: Mr. Trump is desperate, but that's not because Mr. Trump has had something wrong with him. I understand people don't like his style. He is very all over the place. He clearly doesn't understand many of these things. When he first began talking about tariffs, he really said that they would be paid for by the countries that he targeted. He didn't understand that Americans pay a tariff to the American government. That had to be explained to him over and over again. And even now, he sometimes seems not to quite get that. His language is the tariff is going to be paid by the Chinese. No, it isn't. It's a little bit like in his first presidency, he told the Americans that he was going to build a wall to block off the Mexicans and that the Mexicans would pay for the wall. The Mexicans immediately said that will never happen. That will never happen. And it never happened. Right. And so now that he can't say it, so he doesn't say it anymore. Well, the rest of the world isn't going to pay these tariffs either. It's not what's going to happen. And so for me, what I see going on is a desperation that cannot be admitted by the United States. We just had an election between Biden and Trump, and then between Trump and Kamala Harris, in which none of those three presidential candidates said one word about what this underlying problem is. And here it is. The underlying problem is that the American empire is over. The Europeans cannot figure that out. I mean, I watch Macron or Starmer or Friedrich Merz in Germany or the woman Meloni in Italy. I get a lot of language, but they don't seem to be any more able than the Americans to say what I just said. The empire is doing now what every empire in the world has done. After a period, maybe lasting a century, or maybe two, or maybe even sometimes three, then there comes the peak and then the decline. We don't have a Greek empire anymore. We once did, or a Roman Empire, or a Persian Empire, or an Ottoman Empire, or even an earlier Chinese Empire. They're all gone. So the American Empire, we all understood, or should have, would eventually turn down. It wasn't a question of whether, it was just a question of when and exactly how. Well, when is now, and how, well, that's what we're watching. And the how now is desperate actions of extremity, extreme cutting back of spending and extreme imposing of taxes. And we shouldn't be surprised because it's all covered over with a denial of the underlying problem, making people desperate, mostly because what they're trying to do doesn't work. And, I don't know, maybe is it possible that Mr. Trump's policies will somehow work? It's not a zero probability. It could be. I can't predict the future any better than anyone else can, but I wouldn't bet on it. I don't think it's going to work. I think he's going to have more and more disappointment and upset, and he will be busy blaming this scapegoat, that scapegoat, to excuse the fact that it doesn't work. But the irony is, and I say this as a critic of Mr. Trump, that's not his fault. What he's trying to do isn't going to work. One final illustration. Mr. Biden, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Obama, both father and son in the Bush family, all promised in their campaigns for president to bring manufacturing back to the United States. They all promised it. None of them delivered it. Therefore, it would be very naive to believe that Mr. Trump is going to be able to do what none of them were able to do. Is it true that he's going further, going to more extreme efforts? Yes, he is. To his credit, he clearly understood that the others failed. But I must tell you, looking at what he's trying to do, I don't think so. And if I had to point to a single reason, it goes to your question. It's because for the first time in a century, the United States has a serious economic competitor. I like to remind people, and boy, the Europeans seem to need it these days. That may not include the Norwegians, I don't know, but in any case, the GDP of the United States, as I said before, 25, 26, $27 trillion. The GDP of Russia today, maybe $4 trillion. In other words, the United States and Russia were never economic competitors. Russia was much too poor. The notion of the world divided between the United States and Russia was a caricature, should never have been taken seriously by anybody. Did the Russians have nuclear weapons? Yes. Did that make them a more serious adversary? Yes. But economically, no. That's why even today, these notions that the Russians are the ones that have to be held back. As soon as the war in Ukraine is over, they will be. This is the Cold War craziness that has to stop at some point because it is phony. It is a misunderstanding. And this is not a support for the Russians. I'm not a fan of Mr. Putin or anything like that, but it's just looking at the reality. You can't sustain war without an economic foundation. Every war shows that. You know, the Russians have worked very hard to have a big military, and look at them. Are they winning in Ukraine? Absolutely. Will they win this war? They already have. But it is taking them now 3 years, and they are 10 times the size of Ukraine. And yes, the Ukraine's having a lot of help from the Europeans and the Americans, but nonetheless, look at the limits of what Russia can do. And it has mobilized 1 million people to add to its military in order to fight this war. They can't fight Europe. It's silly. They can't. They can't even fight Ukraine and Poland at the same time, let alone. That's just propaganda, which is so bad that it's being believed even by the people who should know better because they understand these things. So for me, this is the setting for the so-called trade war. And the most important thing about it, and I say this as an economist, is not this or that tariff. It's the uncertainty. It's the fact that Mr. Trump says it's going to be a tariff, then there isn't one. Now it's 25%. Well, now it's 10%. Now it's 200%. This is impossible. What this does is negate what the whole tariff was supposed to do. I'll give you a simple example. If you're a manufacturer of automobile parts and you have a factory in Mexico, which many of them do, you did that over the last 30 years because of NAFTA, because of the agreement that goods can flow from Mexico into the US, like from Canada, into one another of the three countries without a tariff, without any obstacle, free trade. So you could take advantage of the much lower wages in Mexico, produce it there, put it on a truck, and drive it across the border into Texas. No problem. Very profitable. They all did that. Okay, if you put a tariff, which Mr. Trump has said he's going to do, against all goods coming from Mexico into the United States, you're doing away with those profits. And the idea, we're supposed to believe, is that the company with the factory making the goods in Mexico will now move the factory into the United States, making the Mexican workers unemployed and giving jobs to Americans instead. But here's why it won't work. Even if the tariffs stayed in place, the problem is that the American worker remains much higher paid than the Mexican. So how is the American company or any company, European company, how are they going to make a living because they avoid the tariff, but they have to pay the much higher wages? This is a very iffy proposition. But even that is not the end of the story. The end of the story is you don't know whether this tariff will be in effect next week, next month, next year. And so you're not going to make a very expensive, time consuming movement of your factory from outside to the United States when there's so much uncertainty. You could end up spending a fortune, move your factory, lose business for 2 years as you move it, only to discover that the tariff that provoked your movement is no longer in place. Why not? Because Mr. Trump is bargaining. He wants benefits, and he will, in exchange, get rid of the tariffs or lower them very drastically. Because you don't know. It may be much, much less expensive to pay a 10% tariff than to undertake the movement of a factory, which is very likely to be the case in many, many industries. So all of this is very iffy, very questionable, very much not a cut and dry thing. And Mr. Trump's up and down. This last week he said, "Oh yes, of course these tariffs on China will come way down. They won't be zero, but they'll come." Okay, well, every boardroom, if every Chinese company took note of what he just said, and whatever decisions they made are on hold. And by the way, if you understand capitalism and how it works, you'll know that if the employer class, the 3 or 4% of the people in any country who are employers and who therefore make the decision how much to invest, where to invest, what to invest in, those people are holding back now, trying to figure out, will Mr. Trump prevail? Will the opposition emerge? Will he lose the midterm elections next autumn, et cetera, et cetera? If the business community holds back investment, then we have a recession. And here in the United States, I can assure you the number one topic, I'm talking to you from downtown Manhattan. I can walk to Wall Street from where I'm sitting now. The number one conversation here is not about whether we're going to have a recession, but only when it will hit, how bad it will be, and how long it will last. And I don't know if the rest of the world understands this, but that's what the Wall Street people whose lives and incomes depend on this, that's what they're talking about. And that's been true now for the last 3 weeks, and there's no end in sight.
Yeah, I was gonna say if I was an investor, I would, yeah, I would possibly look favorable upon some tariffs if it provided some protection or yeah competitive advantage for my industry. But I would before you start building factories and training workers, you would like to know if it's gonna stay up for more than 20 minutes, I guess.
Yes,
So it is not
and he
ideal.
and he's making it, and he's not stupid. I mean, and he has around him people who will explain to him. Ever since John Maynard Keynes did his work, which, if you ever read it, is premised on the notion of uncertainty and how powerful a force that is in a capitalist economy because of the private enterprise decision making, which is always, do we invest now, knowing that it takes several years between the moment an investment decision is made and the time when the output comes off the assembly line. You always have to guess. You always have to make a guess about what it's going to be like 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, which no one can know. It's only a guess. And yet you have to commit now to something whose profitability you can only guess about. That means anything that would disrupt guesswork is immediately dangerous. Of course, if you had a rationally planned system, knowing what Mr. Keynes taught us, you would not allow that to happen. You would make sure that investments continue regardless of the guesswork. But that's already, then we're heading over into the area of socialism. And as you know, at least in our country, that's a taboo. You can't discuss that, and you can't discuss sex, and you can't discuss several other topics of great interest, but are taboo.
Um, what are good indicators, though, of economic or imperial decline or even economic collapse? What is it that you're looking at? Is it the failure of reinvesting money back into the US? Is it the extent of the debt? The
I'll give you several.
Yeah,
Uh,
seven.
and they're so obvious that my wife is a psychotherapist, so I borrow concepts and language from her practice. Americans are caught in a syndrome for which the key word is denial. They don't want to see something. It is urgently important not to see it. You know, it's like a love affair if it ends. The one or the other of the partners don't want to see the end because it's very painful and they wish it weren't the case. And so, the famous remark here in America, only your best friend will finally tell you having observed that this is over now, right? So I have compassion. I am an American. I was born here. I've lived here all my life. I've worked here all my life. I'm sitting in New York City, which is the financial capital of this country, et cetera, et cetera. Very hard. And so they don't see it, but it's all there. So let me begin. The United States went to war in Vietnam 30, 40 years ago or longer, 50 years ago. And our enemy there was the Communist Party of Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. The United States lost the war. The United States is a big, powerful, rich country. Vietnam, let alone North Vietnam, is the opposite. Poor, been poor a long time, very limited military resources, and on and on and on. And the United States lost. Who runs Vietnam today? It's the Communist Party, the same party that was the adversary in that war. Who runs Afghanistan today? The Taliban. Who was the enemy of the United States in that war? The Taliban. Who left Afghanistan? The United States. What did the United States do in Afghanistan? Fight a war which it lost. It went to war in Iraq. I don't know exactly what they thought their goals were, but they didn't achieve them. And they're now losing in Ukraine, which has been a war between Russia on the one hand and then Ukraine slash the US on the other. Okay, these are signs of a serious problem for an empire because it has fought several wars with countries much smaller, much poorer, much less militarily organized, and lost over and over again. That's a sign of an empire in trouble. But it's the least of it. Here's another one. In economics, we have a measure. It's a very crude measure, but it's a measure of the size of an economy. It's called the GDP, Gross Domestic Product. Many people know about it. And we measure it for all countries in the world. Each year, we have a number that tells us what is the rough size. It's just adding up the total output of goods and services in one calendar year in a country. Okay. The GDP of the United States and its major allies, known as the G7, that's the United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. If you add those all up, it's about it's 7 countries, and they have together about 28% of the global GDP, the total output of goods and services of all countries on this planet. Okay? Now, for most of the last 75 years, this was the center of the global economy. The G7 accounted for a wildly disproportionate amount, and they still do, although not what they once did, of exports, imports, capital movements, foreign investment, whatever, all of it. And the US dollar was the currency that they presided over. Okay, right now, I did the same calculation for the People's Republic of China. And I asked, what is the GDP there? And what is the GDP of the alliance that they've built called the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus another 10 or 15 countries that have joined the BRICS since the original 5. Okay, what is it today? If the G7 is 28% of global GDP, what is China and the BRICS? Answer, 35% of global GDP. In other words, and for the first time since the Second World War, we have a new world economy in which there are two big economic power blocks, not one, two. The one that used to be dominant is now number two, not even close to number one. 28 and 35 are far apart. And the gap is growing. That is, every year, including right now, including 2024, the rate of growth of the China BRICS is significantly higher, double or triple what it is in the West. I'll give you, if you want the numbers, I have them all in my head. I work with this stuff every day. I can tell you. In other words, the gap is actually growing worse to the favor of China, to the disfavor of the G7. Okay, this is a total transformation. Here, I'll give you a couple of ideas of what it means. Now, when any country in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or increasingly now in Europe too, when there's a need for a railroad to be built somewhere, or a port to be built or expanded somewhere, or a proper medical system to be established, where do the representatives, public or private or partnerships, where do they go? Do they go to Washington and London the way they always did? Yes, they do. But when they're finished, they don't go home. They get on an airplane and they go to Beijing or New Delhi or Sao Paulo. And they ask for the same support, an export market, an import source, capital investment, whatever. They ask the Chinese and their allies, here's what we got in London and New York. Can you do better? We don't favor either of you, but we have to do this at the best terms we can get. And the Chinese are now richer and they give them better terms. That's why if you look at the railroads being built in Africa, they're mostly being built by Chinese. If you look at the big ports emerging in Latin America, they're all Chinese. There's no mystery here. But to not see what it means, you got to be crazy. You have to have a level of denial that is stupefying. If you add up the population of China and the BRICS, it's between 50 and 60% of the people on this planet. The United States has 4.5% of the people on this planet, and the G7 has under 20%. There's no comparison. And now that China has shown us that it can match high tech development on a par with that of the United States, which they have done. Every great high tech company here, Apple, Amazon, Intel, you name it, has an analog, has an equivalent in China. And in a number of cases, the Chinese now are already ahead of the Americans. Electric vehicles, no contest. The Chinese won that. Solar panels to convert the sun into electricity, the Chinese, and we're not going to catch up because they keep making advance. The best battery for an electric car has been produced by the BYD Corporation, a Chinese car company that can now recharge your car in 5 minutes. Takes less time to recharge the electric car than it takes to put gasoline in your car the way we have always done, and changes everything. So the problem in the United States is that when I go through, and I could keep going if you want, this morning's headline, either in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, gives you another way of understanding it. A survey has been done, and it shows that the number of young men, not women, men going to college after they finish high school is dropping dramatically. Why? It's too expensive. The atmosphere in the country is that it's not important. Universities are not important. Okay, this this is as if when I read that, I'm watching slow motion self-destruction. This is capitalism, US capitalism, self-destructing. I teach, because I still teach in American universities. I teach, like all my colleagues, left wing, right wing, we all teach that the future of the world economy is going to favor people with a lot of education, who have technological skills, computer skills. The more menial tasks are going to be done by artificial intelligence of blah, robots and all. What are we doing? The Chinese keep adding to colleges and universities. We are closing them in the United States. This is crazy. More and more American students are going to Europe because they can get a college degree without paying and going into deep debt, which is what you have to do now here. This is not industrial policy. This is the opposite of industrial policy. We are undermining. And by the way, by not having young men go to college, you know what that does to the decision making of employers around the world? Move your production here? No, no, no. Not, you won't have the pool of educated labor you need. You're not going to come here. It's just you're watching desperate activity, trying to hold on and finding it more and more difficult. And the last thing that might interest your audience, as more and more Americans are falling out of the global economy because the United States is not anymore a balanced economy, what we have in this country is we have the financial center, that's New York, and the high tech center that's in California and Massachusetts. Those are successful money making machines. But you know what that means for the rest of the country? That they are junior partners of New York, Massachusetts, and California. And they had little enclaves, but the mass of people in the cities, in the suburbs, and in the rural areas are in more and more difficulty. And so what they did in recent years was move sharply to the right politically, as you see in Europe too. That's why we have Trump. That's why you have, for example, the rather dramatic shift of the Swedish and Finnish political elites. That's why you have on the left Orban and so forth. This is strange, but you're having some of the same problems that we are. But because the United States was so dominant, it's sharper and more dramatic here. But I make you a prediction, and of course, I don't see the future any more better than anyone else. But when the movement to the right has shown itself to be incapable of dealing with these problems, you're going to see a sharp movement to the left. And don't be surprised. That's what's coming because solving these problems requires two things we don't have. One, a willingness to see it, what our problems are, to understand what it means to be on the downside of an empire. And the second thing we don't have is a political organization, a political party able and willing to say that, to teach it, and to come up with a policy to handle it. When we get that, then the left will become a very formidable force here in the United States because our left is large. Our organized left is not here.
Yeah, it's not going to be a fun few years we're going into. It, I guess, yeah, so a brief last question. Do you see any ways of reversing it? Because it feels as if the collapse of empire has already commenced, and I think, yeah, also see this in Europe, though. But is
Yes,
is it too late to reverse any of this?
yes.
Because I just see Trump's efforts to reindustrialize. He wants to do too fast, effectively. A lot of the things, he should, if you want to rebuild the economy, he has to look a bit the way the Chinese did it, but it did take a few decades. But I'm not sure if he's patient enough. So,
And when that left organization that I'm talking about, when it arises, as I think it will do exactly what you just said. It will say we have to look at what the Chinese did and learn from it rather than try to destroy it. It's not working. The American government has designated China as its big problem for almost 20 years now. That began under Obama, if not sooner, if not even earlier than that. It's not working. It's just perfect. It's another example. The Chinese keep growing. Look, according to the IMF, in 2024, the year that was just completed, the fastest growing country among the G7 was the United States, which grew GDP 2.8%. All the rest of the G7 grew slower, less than that, and Germany went into a recession. And Germany used to be the engine of Europe and all of that. The Wirtschaftswunder of the last 75 years. Well, what did the IMF say China's growth was in 2024? 5%. What was India's growth? 7%. Okay, this is 2 and 3 times what the best of the West could do, the United States. And so you're not defeating the Chinese, you're losing. You're losing. And when you're losing, you have to face it so you can minimize your losses at the very least and reverse the situation if you can. I don't see us doing that. I think here's the evidence I would point to if I had to. Literally over the last 3 or 4 days, the Chinese, Xi Jinping, their leader, has made it crystal clear. You keep putting tariffs on us, we won't go as far as you do. The Chinese very cleverly always wait and respond so that the blame for the whole process goes on the initiator, the United States. And then they're very careful to raise less than quite equivalent. That's a game, that's theater, because at these levels it's immaterial. There will be no, and the Chinese are busily organizing how to avoid any trade with the United States. And now here comes the alliance with the BRICS. They have an ongoing alliance with 55 to 60% of the people of the world. That's their resource to try to find alternative markets, to try to find alternative sources. And lest anyone be under a mistake, let me remind you about something having to do with the Ukraine war. When it begins in February of 2022, the president then of the United States, Joseph Biden, the Secretary of State, Blinken, and others said that this was a war that would collapse the ruble, that would collapse the Russian economy, would see the end of Mr. Putin as a leader, and maybe even break Russia up into smaller countries. Unbelievable. None of that happened. Russia's growth in 2024 was faster than that of the United States. I mean, that's the IMF. I'm not my numbers, their numbers. Okay, so what exactly is it that's going on here? Well, the Russians turned to the BRICS. When Europe says we're not, when they blow up the Nord Stream pipeline there in near you up there in the North Sea, and the Russians can no longer sell oil or gas en masse to the Germans and the rest of Europe, they went to the BRICS and they sold their oil and gas to India and China. I mean, I'm making it simpler than it is, but that's the basic story. They solved their problem. They made the sanctions fail. Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. The United States has hit them with sanctions. Europe has hit them with sanctions that don't work. They don't work. They are a failure. You have to you have to at least admit it, which they don't, because they keep talking about more sanctions. So they have to understand it doesn't work, and they have to ask why not. And the answer is the BRICS. Well, then if you have tariffs against China, of course, what the Chinese are going to do is look at exactly what saved the Russians. And indeed, one of the things the Chinese are doing is making loans to Russia to enable Russia to buy what the Chinese can't sell in the United States. And it is so, if you pardon me, obvious that the really interesting question isn't about the strategy, but the blindness of the West, of the United States, and even more of the French and the British and the Germans. Are you seriously, your reaction to this, and I don't mean to blame you, obviously, or for that matter, Norway, which, is not responsible for this. But when I read in the newspaper that Friedrich Merz is going to borrow money in the name of Europe to build a German military with $800 billion, I mean, are the rest of you in Europe going to allow finally that Germany will have the military? Because Germany will never be able to intimidate the United States and China, but it will be in a position, if it has that kind of military, to oppress you again. I mean, my God, the perversions emerging from this blindness, this denial, should worry Europeans. It worries me. My mother was born in Germany. My mother is born in Berlin, and my father in France. I speak French and German since my childhood. I'm an American. I'm born here and work here and all that. But half of me is still part of the European culture and all of that. And I'm very fearful. What I see is very depressing in terms of their desperation, hanging on to the United States, which no longer cares about them, and this kind of weird fearfulness about a Russian, which is nutty. The Russians have their problems and do their bad things, no question. I'm not asking anyone to embrace them, but the notion that they're going to attack, I mean, it's just,
Well, I guess, yeah, the
you
problem
know,
is if you need a course correction, you have to, like you said, you have to first recognize where the problem is. And I think the problem is there's, especially on this side of the Atlantic, there's just too much wishful thinking and commitment to narratives. Like I actually worked in Moscow as a professor there in political economy in 2018, 19, and 20, and I worked on this Greater Eurasia Initiative, which is Russia's initiative to integrate its economy with the East. So when the sanctions began, well, really, yeah, put into high gear in 2022, I said on day one, this will never work. The Russians have been preparing themselves so they can diversify. We cannot, but they can. This is going to be a horrible disaster. And instead of discussing whether or not the metrics of this, whether or not this is correct, the only feedback I ever got was, well, that's what the Russians are saying. Are you supporting their narratives? Why aren't you supporting our narrative? I mean,
yeah,
this is the level of intellectual discourse now. There's no course correction. It's just, if you support us, repeat, we have a form for you. Like just say ABC here. This is
yeah,
all the only thing we have. There's no course correction. We're just gonna go continue digging. It's
yeah. We have that here too. We have that. You make an argument, and the answer is that sounds like Putin's narrative.
yeah.
We get exactly, we get exact, and you look at and say, I mean, I don't care about Mr. Putin, and nothing. I don't like him. There's nothing, I have a daughter who very angry at Putin because of the misogynistic treatment of women, but you can't get anywhere with them. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to hear about it, and it's extraordinary. What would interest me, and obviously it's your program, but if someone like you, especially with your experience, would help us, because here in the United States, there's consternation about why the Europeans would be holding on to this narrative of the terrible, awful, horrible Russians. Wow. I mean, you could be critical of them. They did this or that. Yeah, that's not a problem. But this overarching notion of sort of this domino theory that if you let Ukraine, if you don't support Zelensky, well, then they will come through, Ukraine and take over everybody else. I remember when I hear that here, I remember telling them during the Vietnam War, it was told we have to support the war because if the communists win in Vietnam, then they will take over Laos and Thailand and Malaysia. None of that ever happened. They won in Vietnam. End of story. All of these terrible domino theories were never, ever true. It's very strange. Strange.
It's exactly the same now. After Ukraine, it will be Poland. They keep
Yes.
telling me, I ask for evidence, and that's then they say, well, are you spreading Putin's narrative?
Yes.
So, anyways, Professor Wolf, thank you so much for your time. I always appreciate talking to you.
My pleasure. And please send us a link because we will be happy to post it as well on our media.
Will do. Thanks again.
Bye bye.
Bye.